So we're going to have a look at Where the Picnic Was by Thomas Hardy in this tutorial, and first of all we're going to start off with some context. Okay, so Hardy is an eminent poet and novelist of the Victorian era, and he continued to write poetry well into the 20th century. He died in 1928. Where the Picnic Was featured as the last of a set of 21 elegiac poems entitled Poems of 1912 to 13, which were written as a direct response to the sudden death in November 1912 of his wife of 38 years, Emma Gidford. The collection, the epigram of which is the Latin phrase Veritas Verigia Flamae, the traces of an old fire, that translates as, focuses on Hardy revisiting via his poetic creativity many of the places that were significant in the couple's life together. Their relationship had become cool in the later years of their marriage as his literary fame grew, but it was as if Emma's unexpected death rekindled his former affection for her, and he needed to write these poems in expiation for his later indifference. The set is noted for the ghostly presence of his late wife haunting the places described, or perhaps it is the poet's own ghost haunting the places on these return visits. But, as the last line of this final poem of the set shows, he has now reached an acceptance that she is gone forever, allowing him to move on alone. The picnic in question was a relatively recent memory for Hardy, having taken place in the summer of 1912, shortly before Emma's death. The other guests were two of the most renowned poets of the day, W.B. Yeats and Sir Henry Newbolt, who had travelled to Dorset to present Hardy with a Royal Society of Literature Gold Medal, and accompanied them on a picnic to the South Dorset Ridgeway coastal path, which is the hill to the sea in the poem. So it's important to understand what an elegy is, or an elegiac poem. So an elegy is a sad poem, usually written to praise and express sorrow for someone who is dead. Although a speech at a funeral is a eulogy, you might later compose an elegy to someone you had loved and lost to the grave. Okay, so let us start then looking at the first stanza of the poem. He starts off with, "Where we made the fire in the summertime of branch and briar on the hill to the sea, I slowly climb through winter mire and scan and trace the forsaken place quite readily." What's important, I think, is that we start with this collective pronoun we. Okay, so in this stanza he's reflecting on the past. So this is his wife, Yeats and Newbolt, as we just spoke about in the context bit, and there's obviously a link to the epigraph here, isn't there, where we made the fire. Okay, so remember that the epigraph is the Latin, which means the traces of an old fire. Fire, we might also suggest like an old flame, so the idea of love. But fire is an interesting image because it's also got connotations of kind of destruction and violence, and potentially some people view that this ends with acceptance, this poem, but I would say there's certainly still a sense of a kind of a destructive turmoil within him as he deals with his feelings about his wife's death. So importantly, we start off in the summertime, and that has lots of positive connotations, doesn't it, of warmth and growth and happiness. It definitely has got connotations of being carefree. It is a summertime though of branch and briar. What's interesting about that is that we get these hard plosive sounds in branch and briar, so that doesn't kind of fit with the normal positivity that we would expect from summertime. There's kind of hard sound to them. Briar is also a prickly shrub, like a wild rose. So yes, we've got connotations of love, but also that sense of something being sort of sharp. So again, there's a duality in the kind of meaning there. Now notice how many of these words in the opening are monosyllabic. Where we made the fire. I mean everything except for summer. Okay, I think that creates this sense of like a slow march and a kind of somber downbeat tone to the poem, which is obviously suitable because he's reflecting on his lost love. We get this contextual reference on the hill to the sea. We know that's where they went to, and then we get a shift. Okay, I slowly climb. So this is him reflecting in the first 4 lines of the stanza about the visit when he was with his wife, and this is him now going back to revisit the same place they had the picnic on his own. So we've got that singular pronoun, slowly. So that adverb's really suggesting that he's got a lack of drive, a lack of energy. And then we've also got this shift in seasons through the winter mire. Now mire is like a swampy or boggy ground, okay, and what that suggests is that there's a sort of Maybe it's like an unpleasant situation that it's hard to trudge through, it's hard to bear. So there's a sense, I would say, and this is a kind of theme throughout poetry, which we will have looked at when we talk about To Autumn, another poem in the anthology, in the contrast between summer, which is a time of kind of life, and winter, which in terms of the natural seasons is a time of death. So there's a real shift in tone that comes from the shift in seasons, and I think we've got those kind of connotations of cold, harsh, unwelcoming conditions. And then what he does there, and scan and trace the forsaken place quite readily. So scan and trace, we've got these monosyllabic verbs which demonstrate the process of still searching for her. You know, he's still looking to find her there, which suggests that he's not quite ready to move on. And obviously he's kind of reflecting on his partnership with his wife here. He describes it as the forsaken place. What that means, I think, is like it's a place of loneliness. It feels, even though it's the same place, it feels deserted and abandoned because the people who were there before are not there anymore. Now, whilst he's still looking, there's a sense of a process of searching going on. The fact that he uses this adverbial phrase quite readily suggests that there's like a desire to discover, a desire to kind of revisit the place, to maybe find some kind of peace with his feelings about his wife, and maybe, like we talked about, that loss in affection towards the end of their relationship. And obviously this is an attempt for him to kind of reconnect with her and the sense of their relationship. Okay, so let's have a look at the second stanza. Now a cold wind blows and the grass is grey, and the spot still shows as a burnt circle, I, and stick ends charred still strewn the sward whereon I stand, last relic of the band who came that day. So obviously we've got nature here reflecting his feelings, haven't we? You know, we've got the cold wind blowing, that fits into this idea of it being a winter mire. This is pathetic fallacy, isn't it? Because the weather is reflecting his kind of somber mood. Then we get this fronted conjunction. So it's not only that a cold wind blows, but the fronted conjunction and is emphasizing that there's more terrible things, you know, it's a real sense of adding to the negativity. And the grass is grey. So we've got this alliteration here, but it feels really flat, doesn't it? And so I think that adds to the bleak tone that we've got. The grey colour is obviously symbolic of the way that potentially his life is kind of dull and lifeless now that his wife is gone. So the picnic spot is now this joyless, melancholy place. But so we've got this another fronted conjunction, but a different one to tell us there's something, you know, that we need to recognise. But the spot still shows as a burnt circle, I. And then he carries on to say that basically there's the charred remains of where they had a fire. Okay. Now the charred remains are, I think, a kind of quite brutal reminder of the death of his wife and their earlier love. And there's this sense of really all that's left behind are kind of like the scars of the picnic, really. Obviously we've got this image of fire linking into their epigraph that are of the traces of old fire, and obviously it's happening in a kind of literal sense here, isn't he, that he's kind of tracing the old fire of their picnic, but in a kind of more profound sense he's also tracing the kind of fires of his relationship with his wife. Sounds are really important here, so look at all this sibilance. Spot still shows, stick still strewn. Okay, on one hand the sibilance is kind of drawing our attention to the circle that's left from the fire, and I think maybe we could say it's creating the sounds of this cold wind, the hissing sounds of the wind, and it certainly gives it a kind of sad tone. And that sibilance is counterbalanced with some plosive sounds in the burnt circle, the stick ends, okay, and the sword. Okay, so you've got those sibilant sounds, maybe creating the hissing of the wind, creating this tone of sadness, and then you've also got the plosive sounds, which are quite harsh and quite hard. So overall, I would say we've got this kind of tone of lamentation, regret, maybe a sense still of like anger and bitterness. Again, first person pronoun, where I stand, last relic of the band who came that day. Now, relic's an interesting choice because a relic's an artifact of significance, which has kind of historical importance. So it's like he kind of contains the last little bits of what happened that day. You know, almost suggests that he has some kind of historical importance in sort of remembering and carrying forward all of their memories and ideas. Also interesting, we finish with an exclamative, who came that day. Okay, and I think it's fair to say here that he's very much focused on his own feelings and state. He's kind of, this is all about his own grief. It's not so much about his wife, it's about his feelings about the death of his wife. Okay, so the last stanza starts with this kind of positive affirmation of yes, you know, so what that does is it really confirms his continued presence. I am here. Okay, so we've still got this first person pronoun. We've had that 3 times now. Now, some people see that as just being kind of symptomatic of the fact that he is talking about his grief on the loss of his wife. Some people perceive him to maybe be a little bit self-pitying. That's perhaps a bit cruel, but certainly he's focused on his grief and on himself as the person who remains. Just as last year, and the sea breathes brine from its strange straight line, up hither the same as when we 4 came. Okay, so we get this personification of the sea breathing brine, and it's interesting that that is then extended from its strange straight line. Okay, I think maybe there's a sense that the sea is somewhat disconcerting because it just carries on. Whilst we're mortal, it carries on and it has a kind of regularity. It's an interesting idea though, isn't it? Because actually the sea is not an aspect of nature that is unchanging. The sea changes all the time, so the fact that he represents it as kind of having a uniformity feels a bit unusual for me, and I think that is what makes it slightly disconcerting. We've also got a continuation of the sibilants, haven't you? Sea, breeze, strange, straight. Okay, so continuing that kind of somber tone. I mean, I think personifying the sea makes it seem maybe a little bit threatening as well, the way that it's breathing brine. And certainly he seems to kind of, when he goes back to revisit the picnic space, he certainly seems to find it a kind of unsettling experience, and he's definitely not connected to nature through it. There's a sense of being kind of detached from and outside of things, which I think comes through there as well. Right, where did we get up to? Up here, as when we 4 came. So I think it's important that this is end stopped here. There's a sense of kind of change and finality, that things are different. He also returns to the collective pronoun here, we, as he kind of reflects on what happened when they came all together. And I think that kind of gives us a sense of kind of nostalgia and of him reminiscing and reflecting upon the past. And then we get this additional pause in the dash. Okay, so we not only get the end stopping, it's then followed with the dash. So this is quite unusual, but 2 have wandered far from this grassy rise into urban roar where no picnics are. Okay, so there's a real sense of a pause that comes here. I think that's creating that real sense of kind of change, that this is the past when there are 4 of them now, and now it's the present when the other 2, Yates and Newbolt, have gone back to the city and she's died and he's left on his own. Okay, and I think that's kind of reinforced with the roar, the urban roar. Okay, so we've got a kind of juxtaposition between nature and the urban environment there, which maybe fixed with a kind of more romantic sense of nature. Remember, the romantics didn't always find nature beautiful. I mean, it was certainly awe-inspiring, but certainly like the sense of the sublime is that it can also be terrifying. So the way that kind of nature is grey and it's a winter mire here doesn't stop it being or having romantic elements to it. Obviously it's not written in the romantic era, but he would have read romantic poetry. Okay, and then we get one pause. We've got another caesura, has shut her eyes forevermore. Now it's interesting that we get this euphemism or periphrasis at the end here, that perhaps he still can't speak of her death. There's an indirectness there, and you know, this is the this is the last line in the collection as well. Okay, the whole collection has been about the death of his wife, and so there's a sense, really, you know, obviously I told you it's about the death of his wife, but if you were coming to the poem for the first time and the whole collection finishes with "as shut her eyes forevermore," there's a kind of dramatic effect there, isn't there, and an impact for the reader, and we're left with that sense of finality that she's died. The only thing we haven't talked about, I think, is the complex rhyming structure, and if you go through and track that, I've kind of written it on here for you. It doesn't follow any kind of regular rhythm or structure, so potentially, you know, that's reflecting on his kind of confusion, the way that he's unsettled by his grief. Interestingly, the third stanza is a bit longer, and it's the one that contains this revelation about her death, and I think the length of that reflects the intensity of his feelings as he articulates his grief about the death of his wife.